So the first thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is that in learning mindfulness, there's kind of two different paths that we can take. And one is the path through wisdom, and the other is the path through faith or trust. And the one that related to me the most is teaching and learning through wisdom, because I tend to personally struggle with doubt, which is kind of a barrier to being able to develop faith. And as far as faith goes, and this is something that you can find in a lot of different teachings, have contemplative practices that we can bring mindfulness to those practices as well. And sometimes where you can run into trouble with faith is getting caught up in dogma and kind of losing sight of the big picture. So it's just something to think about in terms of what kind of a teacher serves you best and the advantages and disadvantages of different kinds of teachers for you. And sometimes I find it helpful to spend some time with a teacher who's more on the faith side of things, to kind of wear away at my self-doubt and worry. So there are skillful things that you can do with either kind of teacher and either kind of approach to learning mindfulness and contemplative practices. So the next thing that I want to talk about is feelings and thoughts and meditation. And also a little bit about emotions. And in mindfulness, feelings has kind of a more specific, more neutral kind of sense to it. That when a perception comes in, like you feel body sensation, or you see something or smell something or taste something, there's that initial contact with your senses. And then there's this subtle, or sometimes even not so subtle, kind of feeling or tone that goes along with that. That there may be this initial sense that something is pleasant or unpleasant, or that something is neutral. And in terms of our day-to-day activity, neutral are the things that our brain often kind of discards as not being pertinent. But it could be distracting, perhaps, when we need to concentrate on something specific, if we're constantly being bombarded with all of these neutral sense impressions. And then there are things that are pleasant. And the thing to be aware of with things that are pleasant is the thing that can go along with that is a craving to have more of whatever that is, which for me is a thing that comes up a lot with food, or sometimes even wanting some food because it's going to make me feel a certain way to eat a piece of chocolate. And then as pleasant fades to neutral, there can actually be an unpleasant feeling that goes along with that, of the clinging to the pleasant sensation that we had before. And then there are unpleasant sensations. Often these seem kind of the most difficult to work with. And there are techniques like kind of digging into the components that make up whatever that unpleasantness is coming from, like seeing where it is in the body, maybe what does this remind us of, maybe noticing the thoughts that we're having about the unpleasant perception is separate from the raw perception itself. So the kind of next step that can arise from these initial impressions, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, there are some things that we call the three poisons, or the three unwholesome mind states. And these are kind of like special categories of thoughts that we want to be aware of. You might say, going back to the boat analogy, these might be like rocks or logs in the river that we want to kind of steer around. And so the first unwholesome mind state is greed or craving, which I already mentioned a little bit, or clinging, going from a pleasant to neutral or unpleasant sensation. And the antidote to this greed or craving is generosity. See if you can bring a spirit of giving and letting go. And then turning to the neutral sensations, what can arise from that, or from not noticing neutral sensations, is delusion or ignorance or doubt. And the antidote to delusion is to be curious, to inquire, to seek clarity, maybe talk to a teacher or somebody who's an experienced meditator to ask questions about whatever it was that happened. Trying to remember things that our teachers have taught us. And for myself, I have kind of a special category of doubt, which is doubting things that aren't reasonable to be doubting. And in those cases, it's just useful to notice that I'm doing that and say, oh, I'm like questioning, did I lock the front door to the house, even though I'm 40 miles away and I can't actually do anything about that anymore? So often in guiding meditation, I encourage people to try to focus on those neutral sensations because they can be a little harder to miss, or a little easier to miss rather, and like pleasant or unpleasant sensations that kind of grab our attention whether we want them to or not. And there are a few other things that we may run into in meditation to be aware of, on guard for. One of them is called sloth and torpor, which would be drowsiness or low energy. But sometimes you might feel like you're doing everything you can just to not fall asleep. Sometimes an antidote to that can be to try to focus on something that's a little more challenging to focus on, like the feeling of your breath on your upper lip and inside the nostrils, or maybe the movement of air in the room. Or sometimes you might get up and do some walking meditation instead. And a couple hacks that I use often in meditation is if I have a painful sensation somewhere, I'll focus on the painful sensation. Often that will wake me up. Or tuning into a feeling of restlessness. And one day I was at a extended meditation and I had one person behind me who was snoring and another person in front of me who was I was honestly feeling some ill will toward this person because he was very restless and he kept taking sips of water and noisily putting down the cup that he was drinking out of. But then I noticed that that feeling of being annoyed was helping me to fight through the drowsiness that I was feeling of kind of getting sucked into the guy snoring behind me. So I kind of set those two opposing feelings against each other. And then somehow kind of turned into a feeling of gratitude that those two people were there to help me practice. So one thing that I want to go back to is feelings of ill will or hatred or aversion, like particularly with painful sensations. Aversion is something that comes up for me a lot. Like, I wish this pain would just go away. Why doesn't it just stop hurting? So an antidote that you can bring to that feeling of aversion is um, like some loving kindness and compassion for yourself, for other people, just wishing that you will be well and you will find ease in your well-being. Maybe I could have felt some compassion for the guy who fell asleep. Maybe imagine a little bit that maybe something is going on in his life. Sometimes you can find a little bit of joy, especially if there's a pleasant feeling that you can tune into. And restlessness and worry is another thing that you can encounter in meditation. I'll find myself worrying about things, as I mentioned. Sometimes it's enough just to tune into that same feeling of joy that you can find just from meditation itself. Like when you've been practicing for a while, you may find that just the feeling of the breath starts to have a pleasant feeling to it. And you can work on sort of nurturing that feeling. Fear is another thing that we sometimes deal with and that we can, doesn't necessarily come up during meditation. I mean, sometimes it may. And sometimes if we're feeling fear or anxiety, we can take an opportunity to take some mindful breaths and find some courage. And once again, some compassion for ourselves and for others. And something that comes up a lot in terms of thoughts is thoughts of the past and future. And what helps with that is to, number one, to work on letting go of the past and letting go of the future for the moment. Perhaps acknowledging to yourself that this meditation is going to be over at a particular time. And you can resume thinking about the past and future then. And it's also a good opportunity to focus on perceptions, sensations in the body, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, sights, things that are happening right here, right now, as opposed to things that are constructed by the mind. And pain is another thing that comes up in meditation, which is something I'm still personally working to handle more skillfully. The things that one thing that I technique that I use is to try to find another sensation that's a little less painful than the main sensation that I'm noticing, or kind of mentally inventory the painful sensations in the body. You can also try to take apart the components of the sensation, trying to imagine how much space it takes up in the body. You might try to imagine if it has a color or a shape. You might try to notice if there are different sensations in the same area, like hot or cold, muscle tension. So that was a lot to digest, but I hope that at least one or two things stay with you or that you remember them later.